Good afternoon. My name is Hillary Paul McGuire. I was born as Paul Gerald McGuire in Oklahoma City. When I was about 20 years old, I entered the monastery of Benedictine Monastery in Oklahoma, and they gave me the name Hillary. And I spent the next 20 years of my life as a Benedictine monk, a brother in the Catholic Church, and I was assigned to be a teacher of mathematics. So when I was teaching it in the monastery in Oklahoma, at the college in Oklahoma, the abbot one day said that he needed a teacher in East LA because we, namely the monastery in Oklahoma, was responsible for staffing a parish in East Los Angeles, and they'd had it for 75 years. And I had been there a few times in my youth, and so the abbot said, "Hillary, you can go to East LA and teach math there in the school." So when I was in East LA, I became an apostle. In the monastery, when you're just sitting in a monastery and praying once in a while, you lose touch with the world and with how life is. So when I went to East LA, I got a real good dose of how the people lived. That's when I started teaching tennis to the gang members, because the gang members came into the schoolyard and wanted to try the tennis racket, and so of course I lent them one, and they started hitting the balls all over the place, including over the buildings and up on top of the buildings. But they still wanted to learn how to play tennis the proper way, and so I taught them, and they were very enthusiastic and very athletic and very well coordinated as tennis players. So I was doing fine with them until after 2 years in East LA, the abbot said, "Hillary, you're causing too much trouble in the parish yard, in the schoolyard, and in the parish in general, because the gang members come into the rectory office and they slam their hands on the desk, and they say to the secretary, 'We want to see Brother Hillary.' And when she balks at that and doesn't play along with them, then they threaten her. And so sure enough, they have slashed her tires on her car, and so she's threatening to quit, and I'd rather get rid of you than lose her." So anyway, he called me back to the monastery. He called me up on a Friday afternoon. I remember he called from Oklahoma. Here I was in East LA. I was planning on taking the kids to a tennis tournament at USC on Saturday morning, and he said, "Hillary, pack your bags. You're coming back to Oklahoma." So I said, "Well, Father Abbot, don't you think I'm doing a good job here?" And he said, "Hillary, we'll talk about it when you get here." So, of course, we never did talk about it because he didn't want me there anymore, and that was the end of the story. So, but when I was back in the monastery, I decided that I could help the kids by writing a book about them, because they needed to have a book that they could relate to, and it's called Hopi and the Los Holmes Gang, and copies are still available on the internet today. Hopi was the gang member who was the leader of the gang. They didn't officially have a leader, but he was obviously the leader. Everybody followed, and so he was the obvious title for the book. Hopi is his name was Job from the book of Job in the Bible, but in Spanish a J is pronounced like an H, and so they called him Hobi, and it became Hopi, and so I named the book Hopi, and the name of the gang that he had was Los Homes, which is a mixture of Spanish and English, as they do so commonly. They mingle the two languages, and in fact it's commonly known as Spanglish. And so the Los means the, and Homes is the English word homes. So Los Homes means the homes, and homes is what they call their gang members. So they say, "Hey, homie, hey, Holmes, how's it going today?" And so I wrote a book about them, and it's called Hopi and the Los Homes Gang. Hopi is spelled Hopie. And anyway, I took it to the abbot, and I said, "Well, Father Abbot, as a monk, I have to ask your permission to have the book published." And I found a publisher. I had sent out query letters to 36 publishers, and only one of them was interested. And so the abbot said, "Well, if they'll publish it, I'll let you publish it. I don't want to read it." So he didn't even read the book, and he didn't have any more interest in my book than he had in my work with the gangs when I was in East LA. So the book was published in 1979, and since then, well, actually, so I wrote the book in the monastery in 74, and the abbot. Oh, and at the same time, I became a sculptor, because while I was in the monastery in 73, 74, after coming back home from East LA, I was walking through the fields and came across this stack of cast-off farm equipment, and I saw the buzzard wing sweep, and that was what started me making a sculpture, because I thought the buzzard wing sweep had beautiful curves, and it had holes in it, and it would go together with other things, and it made a perfect base for a sculpture. So I cast around among the cast-off equipment there, and I put things together and started making sculptures, because I knew that it seemed to me when I first picked up the buzzard wing sweep that the Holy Spirit, that's one of the members of the Trinity, so it seemed that the Spirit was saying to me through the buzzard wing sweep, was saying, "Show me to the world." So it was my mission was to show the buzzard wing sweep the beautiful shape and the beautiful texture and the character that this has. This is very manly stuff, the parts that I select, and very full of dignity and patination, which is the basis of many sculptures. You very seldom see a sculpture that is not patinated. But that's a synthetic process, and this is natural patination that occurs when the nature, the works of nature, the processes of nature take over after somebody has made a shiny new buzzard wing sweep and the farmer has used it for 30 or 40 years and cast it aside as no longer usable in any way. The buzzard wing sweep is then patinated by the rusting process of nature, God's process. And so that's why I selected what I call antique iron with character as the basis of my sculptures. That's what I say the buzzard wing sweep is. It's a antique piece of iron with character that has accrued from the use by the farmer. Okay, so here we have the fully blooming 12 blossoms, 12 sprouts, and each sprout has numerous parts of the bloom. Let's see, this got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this would be 6 and 7. I don't know. So half dozen or more flowers on each sprout, each stem, and so that means that there are at least a dozen bulbs down here that are giving rise to these flowers. And I think of these flowers as analogous to my sculptures, because like my sculptures, the greenery, which the green fountain of leaves that comes up in December and January, is like the buzzard wing sweep. Here's a buzzard wing sweep. Where have I got one handy? There's one right there. Anyway, the buzzard wing sweep is shiny and new when it's made in the factory and put on the shop shelf to be sold to a farmer. And so that's the way the fountain of leaves is analogous to that brand new piece of farm equipment or railroad equipment or any of these things. They were all brand new one time, and then they were used and worn out, and in similar fashion the fountain of leaves gets old, dies away, and is gone as if to the grave, as just as these pieces of antique iron that I use are cast off into a graveyard of old equipment and thought to be worthless and unusable by anybody. But I come along and I see the beauty in the design of them and the character that their age and their destruction has so when they're used by farmers, they can get bent, broken, and or just disfigured in one way or another. And then I come along and I see the beauty of them and the character in them and the stories that they seem to be relaying from out of their past, talking to us about our past. And I take them and make them into a new sculpture, like these flowers coming up from perfect desert conditions. Suddenly, around the 1st of August, these sprouts came shooting up. So that's like when I select a piece of antique iron and I take it to my bosom and I ponder it and I put it together with others. And when I make it into a new sculpture, that's like the flower blooming anew, blooming out of nowhere and blooming out of death, seeming death. They were totally gone from the scene, and suddenly they are resurrected. And these are called Assumption lilies, named for the feast of the Assumption of Mary, the mother of Jesus, whose feast day the church celebrates on August 15th. So these started blooming on August 15th. This is now the 17th. No, this is the 18th today. And they have come into full bloom over the past 3 days. And so they represent the full blooming of my sculptural philosophy and the fact that my sculptures, my approach to sculptures has given rise to a whole new breakthrough, so a whole breakthrough in the field of sculpture whereby my sculptures enable us human beings to express ideas, concepts, or relationships, human relationships, which we were never able to express before, at least not in the same way as my sculptures are able to. So the first sculpture we're going to talk about is entitled "To the Ancient, Respect is Due." So this sculpture is representative of the relationship of parent to child. And the reason so I entitle it "To the Ancient, Respect is Due." That is, every child looks upon his parents as being ancient and should be expressing respect at all times for where he or she came from, and for the wisdom and the experience of his or her parents. And in this sculpture, that is beautifully expressed, if I do say so myself, by the fact that this is the adult grounded in the earth and springing forth and yet getting so old that he is gnarled with age and bent over and just old as heck. Okay, so then this is the young person, totally dependent on having sprung entirely from the loins of his parents and shooting off into the future on the basis of the wisdom and nurture of his or her parents. So I see this as beautifully representative of the concept and the relationship of respect for parents by children, and the relationship between parent and child. That this is composed of a base, which is this wonderful heavy some part from a car, and then this is a bolt that I stuck in here, a very unusual type of bolt with a hexagonal, I don't know, wrench socket entry place, and then this is stuck in there, and that is the old man bent over and gnarled with age. Then, before I put them together, before I put the old man into the base, then I fitted this piece through this gap here, over, and slid it up here, and balanced it from the old man, and then this piece I can remove. This is a piece of a harness for a horse, or a horse, or a oxen. I don't know exactly which. And anyway, so then I just slip this in here and turn it in such a way, because it could have been in any which way, but I turn it in such a way that it represents the legs of the young man or young woman who's taking off on the wisdom of the old. I utilize them in their proper personality and put them together like a family of all those different pieces, each of which has its own identity, and so then the pieces work together like a family, coming together and as a team, coming up with something new. And that's this sculpture is a new concept that each one individually is not able to express on its own, but that as a unit they can express a whole concept, idea, relationship that as an individual none of them was able to express. This is the piece which I have entitled "The Past Plows for the Future." Some of you may know that this is a plow, but maybe when you saw it you automatically thought that's a plow, but you didn't think about the fact that usually a plow is, in fact, it's designed to have its nose, this part right here, in the ground, and I have mounted it on this piece of railroad equipment, which is called, it's even embossed with the name of the railroad piece. It's called a niver creep, and it's used to keep the railroad ties from moving in their position, when the train comes running by and all the shaking and rolling, they do not the railroad ties do not lose their place, and so this is part of that process which human beings have invented, and it's called a niver creep. But anyway, I've mounted that onto the niver creep, the plow onto the niver creep, and I have pointed the plow up into the air, and indeed with its wings like this, it looks like a bird flying into the air. Or you can take it this way, that it's the coming from its past usage as a nose in the ground sort of thing. It is now with its nose in the air, leading us into the future. So, and the past always leads us to the future. Every day we are learning new things from our ancestors, from our forebears, and so this piece is a perfect representation. Maybe I'm a little bit easy with that word perfect, but it's certainly a representation of the fact that we owe everything to our forebears. So the past plows the way to the future. And it also fits in with my general concept of sculpting, is that we have respect for old age and for the inventions and the ideas and the values of our forebears, people who came before us. So the past plows for the future. Okay, so this piece is entitled Eventful Life, Be Not Forgotten. So I was teaching at San Diego City College, and in 1980, right across the street from City College is San Diego High School. And San Diego High School, behind it, had a stadium, a beautiful stadium. It was, in fact, designed to look like the Colosseum in Rome. And it was so huge that whenever it would rain, I would go jogging on the track that is inside the stadium, not just the track on the field, where the field of play where the Chargers used to play. The San Diego Charger football team used to play there, but I would jog inside the stadium to keep out of the rain, and of course there were all kinds of big runways where people could walk, and so that's where I would jog. But anyway, in 1980, the city of San Diego decided, and the seismologists decided, that it was not sturdy enough to withstand a certain magnitude of earthquake. So they decided they were going to tear it down. It was built in 1915. And it was so sturdily built, and it had these three kinds of rebar in it. This one is a typical ribbed rebar. Rebar, for those who are not familiar with the terminology, it means reinforcement bar, and it is used in the pouring of concrete so that the concrete, when it dries, will not crack apart, and it will be held together by the rebars that are in it. Now, anyway, in 1915, when the stadium was built, they had these three types of rebar, and this one, of course, I loved for its masculinity and its strength and its beauty. But remarkably enough, there were two other types of rebar that even though I had worked in construction for quite a few years, I had never seen rebar like these. This is a rebar that has no ribs whatsoever. And by the destruction process, when they tore down the stadium, the bulldozers twisted it in this shape, and I took it just as it was from the destruction of that stadium, which was at the time called San Diego Stadium, where the Chargers played, where the music group Chicago had concerts, where Charles Lindbergh spoke after he flew across the Atlantic Ocean in his little airplane that was built in San Diego. That was in about 1929, I hear tell. Anyway, there was a third type of rebar, and this one is a square one, square cross section. So if you'd slice it this way, it would be a square. And all other rebar that I had ever seen had a circular cross section. So this one and this one are both circles if you cut them this way. But this one is a square if you cut it this way. And this one has ribs, unlike any other ribs. This is typical rebar even today. But this type is way out of fashion. It's never used anymore as far as I know. And this one, they would say, why would you have a rebar if it doesn't have ribs to help hold the concrete together? So anyway, one way or another, these were three types of rebar that resulted from the destruction of this stadium. And there's all kinds of history and you can find it on the internet today. So though it was down the hill from Balboa Park, where they built the stadium, was still considered to be part of Balboa Park, even though it was like 3/4 of a mile down the hill from Balboa Park. Anyway, so that's why it's called Balboa Stadium, because it's still part of Balboa Park. And it was it was opened in 1915, the year of the Panama Pacific Exhibition, it was a world fair held in San Diego in 1915 and 16. And so it was torn down in 1980, so that's 65 years that it lasted. And yet the rebars themselves are now 120 years old, twice as old as the stadium lasted. So when I saw the destruction of this beautiful stadium, I selected these as the remnants, the last standing remnants of that magnificent stadium. And so I just set them aside somewhere, and I thought about it for a while, and I decided to make a headstone, like a gravestone for the remnants or the memory or memorial of the stadium. Eventful Life Be Not Forgotten is the title that I made for the sculpture. Eventful Life Be Not Forgotten. And then here is more like a typical headstone. Here lie the remains of Balboa Stadium, 1914 to 1980. We want to wrap this up with only a few that we have talked about today. But this one is my masterpiece. The buzzard wing sweep was the basis of my starting with sculptures at all, and I've made it the base for this sculpture. And at the time, I had just come back from East LA, where I had worked with with Chicano gangs for 2 years, and I had spent the subsequent, I was, at the time that I built this sculpture, I was actually writing a book about the kids in East LA. I was thinking of the gang members as I built this sculpture. Excuse me, I'm going to take my bandana off. It's a little warm today. And the kids were living a difficult life. When they were young and rambunctious, hard to handle by their parents, rather than disciplining them, sent them out into the streets of East LA, where that's like being in a trap when your parents can't even handle you. So that's why I started putting these parts together. This is a wolf trap or a coyote trap, and it represents the fact that the parents can't handle them and really don't like don't show much love to their parents. And so then the kids, after growing up from a home like that, they go to school, and their teachers, it's like you're in chains. These are 3 giant chain links, and that's like having teachers who constantly tell you that you're never going to amount to anything, and that you're just a worthless human being. So then they go out from the classroom, from the home, from the classroom, out onto the street, where the police hook them into their cars. They pull up beside them as they're walking down the street, and they say, "Get into my car, I'm going to run your record." And sure enough, at the age of 16 or 17, they already have a police record for having been stopped half a dozen times, and what school they go to, and who they've been hanging out with. So that's like a hook. So they've got these 3 alternatives in their life, all of which are negative, when they're still in their teenage years. And then they usually drop out of high school, and they end up in trouble with the police, really bad trouble, and that's what's represented by the blacksmith tongs here in the base. The blacksmith tongs indicates that they are clamped into the criminal justice system, and either imprisoned, or in many cases, the kids I was working with were dead before they were 25 years old. The wonderful thing about this sculpture is that it is eloquently expressive of the fact that the justice system, that anyone who renders justice, whether it be parents for their children, deciding between who's right and who's wrong in a sibling dispute, or a court action with a judge, any rendering of justice, a decision by a referee of justice, is a complicated thing. There are all kinds of of occurrences which need to be taken into account, and human beings, to a great extent, make mistakes. Sometimes, at least to in some percentage of time, they make mistakes, and so the justice system is well represented with this plethora of possibilities that the judge has to take into account. And if somebody has grown up with so much negativity in his or her life, then the judge needs to be able to be very, very wise in order to render a proper decision. So, justice ain't easy. Thank you.